Well, howdy y'all, this here's Randy, aka Banjo Randy, and I'm a totally blind woodworker, getting back into my woodworking since 2021. And when I say I'm totally blind, I mean I have no physical eyesight no more. I lost what little sight I had left back in 2006 in my right eye. That was my only eye I could see out of at the time. But it is what it is. And I know that y'all are seeing me wearing these glasses, and these are an old pair of prescription glasses that I used to wear when I could see. So when I was getting back into my woodworking, I wanted to wear something to protect my eyes. And rather than buying a pair of glasses, I already had these, so that's why I'm using them. But like I say, I'm as blind as a bat. The differences between me and the bat is I don't fly or sleep upside down. But anyway, this is my latest woodworking project right here. These are 8 cutting boards that I recently made. And this is what they look like. I hope that y'all can see that. And I'm going to try to explain how I went about doing this. Now, as it is right now, I have no idea what cutting board is what orientation they are now, because all my reference marks, being the tape that's right here I used on there, is not on there, of course. So I'm going to try to explain how I go about doing this and being totally blind, making sure that all the pieces are in the right orientation. But, you know, you have to make the best in life, you know, and I'm certainly trying to do that through my blindness, because there's so many things that a person can do without sight, and woodworking is one of them, just like my music. You don't have to be able to see to pick good old bluegrass gospel and bluegrass music. Like I say, I couldn't tell you no more what orientation this cutting board is. All I can tell you is that I use walnut, maple, and cherry. So these cutting boards right here started out as what they call a cutting board kit. This particular one, it had 5 pieces each of walnut, maple, and cherry. Now, they were 3/4 thick, 2 inches wide, and these particular set that I bought, cutting board kit, was 24 inches long. And actually they were about like 24 and a 16th or so, just a whisker over 24, which that worked to my advantage right there. I'm going to try to show y'all how I go about doing this. So the first thing that I did when I got the cutting board kit is I tried to pick out the walnut myself, because, you know, walnut has a very distinctive smell. And that should be, this right here should be walnut. But to make sure, I had a buddy of mine when we went to pick some music to look at it, and he helped me sort out the maple from the cherry as well. So the first thing I done was I took all the walnut pieces, which is these right here, and I don't know if you can see this or not, but there's one piece of tape right there on one face at one end. I do that on all the walnut. Then the maple, it doesn't have any tape. And then the cherry, it has a piece of tape at each end on one face. So once I did that and put the tape on the walnut, I then took and wrapped it up, the 5 pieces in a rubber band, and put them back in the box. And then I put the maple also in the same box with the walnut. And then the cherry, once I knew what it was, I put the tape, like I say, on there at each end and put it in another box. Now when I got started on this, the first thing I done was I started with the walnut. So I took that to my table saw, and I put my miter gauge on there, and I have an auxiliary fence. It's just an aftermarket Delta style miter gauge. So I set a stop for, I believe it was about 12 and a 16th or 12 and 3/16 inches. And then I cut all the walnut pieces first. And of course, all the offcuts of the walnut, like it I know this ain't walnut, but once I cut that apart, there was no tape on the other end of the walnut, which, like I say, this is maple. But the other end of the walnut had no tape on it. So I had to remember to put a piece of tape on that. And then I took and got the maple ones, and I did the same thing. I cut them, and I put the longer pieces, like I say, at one end of the box, and the shorter ones on the other end, as well as with the walnut. Now the cherry, let's see here, right here. The cherry pieces, whenever I cut it, the piece that was on my left, up against the stalk, once I cut that in half, it only had one piece of tape, so I had to put a piece of tape on the other end. And then the offcut side, I had to remember to put 2 pieces of tape on that cherry. Then I put that back in the box. And whenever I got started to making after that, I took and I rejointed all the edges of all the pieces that I cut. They were pretty decent from the box, but I like to sweeten them up just a little bit, so I did a light pass through the joiner on all of them. And then when I got started, the first orientation that I did, that I know that I did, that I can remember, was I took a piece of the walnut, and then I put beside that a piece of maple, and then I put another piece on the other side of it. And I glued these up to start with in blanks of 3 pieces of wood each. Now I could only do 4 blanks at a time because I don't have enough clamps to do that. So I glued up the first 4, let them dry overnight, then I took the remainder of these, in whatever configuration I had them. Some of them I did maple in the middle with walnut on the side and cherry on the edges. I don't remember exactly all of them. But after I got all 8 blanks glued up, like I say, in pieces of 3, the reason I've done that is I don't have a thickness planer. And when I made 2 cutting boards last year, I glued them all up together in one setting, all 5 pieces across. And I tell y'all folks, it took me a long time to sand those down to where they were somewhat even reasonably flat. And so this time I thought, well, actually the first 4 that I made this year, back around April, May of this year, I did the same thing. I glued them up in bundles of 3. But what I did after that, when they dried, is I took them to my joiner, and on the back side that didn't have any tape, I took and set my joiner to make a very light pass, and then I run the piece through. Of course, it was the size of this, full length. And I run the face that had no tape through first, a couple of passes, and made a really nice smooth face. And then very carefully, I took the tape that was on the blank and I removed it and put it on the back side of the same piece. And then I run that face through the joiner. And then after that, I took and run the edge of those 3 through the joiner because I didn't use any clamping blocks. And also when I glued these 3 up to start with, I made sure that one end was as even as possible. After I got all these here blanks of 3, the edges, the faces jointed and the edges, then what I did was I took whatever piece I decided to put on the outside edges, I had to take and rip one piece in half. And it was, I think, about 15/16 is what it wound up being. Excuse me. And also what I had to remember whenever I ripped the walnut and the cherry, what I had to do is I took the tape, whatever end it was, I took it off, and then I turned it with the grain, or against the grain on the face side. And that way when I ripped it in half, it would still have a piece of tape on each piece that I cut. So, I'd know what it was. Of course, the cherry, what I've done, was I put the pieces long ways again this way and then ripped that in half. And then when I ripped the maple in half, I didn't have to worry about it because I never put tape or nothing on the maple. So once that was done, what I had to remember this time when I glued these pieces, edges on, I had to, of course, make sure that it was flush at one end. But these pieces, I wanted them to stand proud just a little bit of the faces of the three pieces in the blank. I hope I'm not confusing y'all. Because this wound up being this blank about probably around 11/16 inch. So the other piece of walnut, it's 3/4. And like I say, I had to make sure that it was just slightly proud of each face. And the reason I did that I glued up 4 blanks at a time, doing the same thing. And then at night, I come back downstairs and I took the blanks out of the clamps, and then I glued up the remaining 4 blanks. Then the next day, after that, I could take all the tape off because it had to come off anyway for this next process. So what I done was I took this to my router table, and I put this here double bearing bit in, which has a bearing at the top and bottom. This is like a combination flush trim / pattern bit. So once I got this chucked up in my router table, then I made sure that the bearing was just slightly above the edge of the piece on the blank, you know, the outside edge here, because remember it's slightly proud of the face. So once I got that set, then I put me an auxiliary fence on my existing fence on my router table. Now when I did this, of course I had to make sure that it was slightly above the very tip of the router bit, right there. Just slightly above it, about 1/8 of an inch above it. And you know, the piece is centered as I could on each side. And then it couldn't be a real high fence because the edges at the time on them blanks, you know, were proud on each face right there. So the auxiliary fence could not be too tall. If it was tall like this right here, then when I run the piece through, it would be slanted and it would bevel the edges instead of flush trimming them. But once I got that done, then I rejointed all the edges, both edges, on all 8 blanks. And then what I did next is I took the blanks to my table saw, once again with the miter gauge, and I just barely trimmed off one end. That's why I tried to make sure that it was even as possible when I did the glue up on there. That way I wouldn't be wasting a lot of material. But I just kissed the edge just a little bit to make it nice and even right there. And then I did that on all 8 blanks. Next, I took my rip fence and set it 12 inches. And then I run 4 of these blanks through at 12 inches. Because, like I say, when I cut these pieces in half, they wasn't exactly in half. You know, the one piece was slightly smaller. I'd say it was about 11 7/8 or so. And remember this piece here, I set it for, I believe it was 12 1/16, somewhere 12 3/16, somewhere in there. So that gave me 4 blanks, that was 12 inches. And then I finally, on these last 4, I set my rip fence for, I believe it was 11 3/4. And then I run the opposite end through and trimmed them up. And that become this blank right here. Next, what I did was the part that we all love, the sanding. But I started out with 80 grit, and I just went over it lightly, and then I switched to 100 grit, and then I switched to 120 grit. After the 120 grit, then I took and I rounded all the corners on all the blanks, and I rounded over all the edges on both faces. Once that was done, then I went to 150 grit, and then I went to 180 grit, and my final grit was 220. Once I had that last final grit done, I wiped them off real good as I could, and I brought them upstairs here on this counter, and I got me a damp rag, because they say you need to raise the grain on these before you finish them, because if you don't, the first time you wash them, they say they'll be real rough then, and you don't want that, of course. So I took a damp rag and I completely wet all the surfaces, all the edges on both faces, on all 8 blanks. And in fact, once I let that set for about 20 minutes, then I repeated the process and let that dry overnight. Then the next morning, once again, I got out the sander with 220, and I completely went over all the faces, all the edges and corners, and got them really nice and smooth and flat again. Now after that, that's whenever I took them back downstairs and I wiped them really nice and clean. And I set these old lids that I keep from like containers of coffee and things. And what I did with that is I used it to set them on. So I made a row of 4 on one side, a row of 4 on the other side. And what I like to use is I use walrus oil, a cutting board finish, made for wooden utensils and things like that. I've never tried anything else, but I really like this walrus oil because it's kind of a thick consistency, and a little bit of this stuff goes a long ways. This one bottle right here, I have done 14 cutting boards, and I did 2 coats per cutting board. So the first thing I done was I put a little bit on there, and then I took with my hands and I just smeared it all over both faces and all the edges and everything. And while I did that, I held it over the cutting board next to it. That way, if there was any runoff, it would go on the board, not all on the counter and be wasted. Once I got them coated, I put them back on the lid, set them on top of the lid, and I did the remaining cutting boards. Now, I let these set for 24 hours. Then I took and I wiped off any excess with a clean rag, and then I repeated the process one more time. And again, I let that set overnight for 24 hours, wiped off any remaining excess, and I took a clean a clean t-shirt anyway, an old t-shirt that I had, and I just buffed them out as best I could, and that was the results right there, these cutting boards. But I hope that I didn't confuse y'all too much, but like I say, I use tape and things in my woodworking, and like I say, I only use walnut, maple, and cherry because it just makes things easier for me. Because, like I say, I'll put a piece of tape on the walnut at one end, like this right here, and the cherry has a piece of tape at each end, and of course on one face, and maple, I don't never put nothing on the maple, right there. And it just makes it so much easier for me. But I kind of hope that maybe this video kind of helps y'all sighted people to understand that, people that are totally blind like me, that we are able to do things, especially woodworking, and be safe about it. It's a lot more difficult for me, I guess, because I have to come up with different ways to still be safe while I'm working, and be able to identify my wood and everything. And as long as that tape stays on there, I'm good to go. But I do have a couple of apps on my phone that I have used, because this go around of cutting boards, there was a piece of tape that fell off somehow, one piece of the cherry, and I knew when I felt of the blank that something didn't feel right, because I had put, if I can find it here again, I had put a piece of walnut, and then on either side of that I had put a piece of cherry. And when I was feeling it, I couldn't feel the bottom tape down here on the end like the other end was, and I knew something wasn't right. So I called an app that I use called Be My Eyes. It's an app made up of volunteers, hundreds of thousands of volunteers. and they volunteer their eyes to help people like me, or that are blind or visually impaired. And that app uses the back camera of your phone. So sure enough, it was cherry on each end, but one piece of the tape had fallen off. So I have to always kind of be mindful of that too when I do my woodworking. But I do have a disability. I'm totally blind. However, I do not consider myself disabled because I can do things being totally blind. And I would also like to say to anybody out there that might be listening or watching this video, if you have a disability, I say never ever give up on your hopes and dreams, because there are things that we can do. Sometimes you just got to figure out what that dream could be for you. Mine, I knew, was woodworking, because I had done woodworking before in the past, so I've got a good knowledge of, tools and equipment and things like that, joinery and all. So I wasn't just starting off, green, as they say. I wasn't a tenderfoot in this stuff. But again, I hope that I didn't confuse y'all or anything trying to explain my process. I had to do it. I didn't have to do it this way. It just made my life easier. I glued it up in strips of 3, then running it through the joiner, because like I say, the first 2 I'd done last year, I did a lot, and I mean a lot of sanding to even get them to where, like I say, they were somewhat flat and everything. But these turned out so much better, I think. But I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and to those of you and us who do woodworking, just be careful when you're down in your shop and wear the proper safety equipment, safety glasses, hearing protection, and just be alert and be aware of your surroundings and everything. And I certainly hope that this was a blessing to somebody somehow. But I hope y'all folks have a wonderful and blessed day, and y'all keep smiling, and y'all have a good one. Blessings. I know that tripod is here somewhere. There we go.
Stop recording video. Button. Stop recording. Take picture. Stop recording video. Button.